Okay. All right, we are recording. Great. Okay, so again, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank our panelists. We have a great panel of educators with us here tonight. These last 9 months have been unlike anything we were expecting when we started hearing about COVID back in February. It has disrupted every aspect of our lives. And tonight we've invited this group of educators to be with us. These are essential members of our communities, our school communities. They have been in a position to learn a lot of new tools and technology to figure out how to engage students in this new learning environment, and have been faced by a lot of challenges and fatigue than they have maybe not experienced for a long time in their career. And also all of us know as leaders in our own schools that we are going to make the most progress in supporting our students if we can all work together, if we can communicate with each other and find ways that we can all swim in the same direction for the benefit of our kids. And so we wanted tonight to create some space to hear directly from our teachers about their work and how we can all move together through the situation that we're in and all of these challenges. And so I would like to go ahead and introduce our panelists tonight. And I think that we've got, just because I had some late breaking information here, I want to make sure we've got everybody here. Do I have everybody except for Jerry, Susan? Is that right?
Annabelle also won't be able to make it.
Annabelle won't hear. Okay. All right, great. Okay, so I'm going to start with Susan. Susan Solomon is the president of UESF. She has also taught preschool and kindergarten in SFUSD for many, many years and has been doing a lot of work in UESF, first as a union representative. She was executive vice president when I first met her, and then now is president. And she is able in this position to work with a lot of amazing educators, include the folks on the panel tonight, as well as families and partners all over the city. And then next we have, so welcome Susan, thank you for being here. Let's see, and I'm going to move next to Chris. Chris Garza is a 7th grade English language arts teacher at Everett Middle School, where he has taught for the past 7 years, and he's in his 11th year overall as a teacher. At Everett, he led the English Language Arts Department for 3 years and also participated as an elected member of the school site council there. He's been an active member of UESF and is currently his site's union building representative, the co-chair of the middle school division, and he's a member of the contract action team, which helps inform and organize other educators. He has 2 young children, and his 5-year-old is a kindergartner at Ortega Elementary School in our district. And then Leslie, who, let's see, she was born and raised in San Francisco, going all to public schools throughout her time here. And currently she is the community school coordinator at Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School in the Portola. And she was previously a social worker at Francisco Middle School. Okay, and then our other 2 panelists were not able to join us tonight, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to share some videos from Jerry Almanza, who is a teacher at Cesar Chavez and wasn't able to be with us, but did send us a little bit of information. So if we have a chance to share that later, we will. So thank you all so much for being here. So I think where I would like to start off tonight, and also just to let everybody know who's attending, you're always welcome to put questions in the chat box if you'd like to. We'll try to get to them. An hour goes by really fast. We've got a good set of questions that hopefully will cover a lot of the questions and topics that we have been hearing from families over time, but please feel free to put other questions in the chat box if you'd like to. And again, we'll get to them if we can. All right. So I think where I'd like to start us tonight is just with the basics. If you can just tell us a little bit about what life is like, sort of day-to-day life in your role right now. What as a community school coordinator, as president of the union, as a middle school teacher. What is it like right now? Chris, why don't we start with you?
Sure. It's great to see everyone. Thanks for having me, inviting us here. So again, I'm a 7th grade ELA teacher at Everett Middle School, and I would pretty much break up the day into 3 parts. There's sort of the student-facing piece, the adult-facing piece with other colleagues, and then my family-facing piece with my 2 young kids. I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, so they're keeping me busy. Pretty much the way like a typical day would go. So if it's like a Monday or a Tuesday, there's usually a time in the very beginning of the day where there's a homeroom class, and basically that's when we get together with a group of students to talk about everything from announcements and logistics about everything happening at the school to socio-emotional things that we're focusing on. There's a program we use called Second Step that's about, how to get through obstacles and how to deal with your challenges and the things that are really important for middle school kids, for all of us actually, but for middle school kids. And community building and that type of work. And then I teach my English language arts classes. I have 3 of those classes, and there's about 25 to 30 kids in each class. And so each one of those are for about an hour. And those classes are typically broken up into about 30 minutes of instruction and about 30 minutes of trying to get some one-on-one and small group support while everyone's in the room together. And then throughout the day, and this is where it gets a little bit different by day, you try to get as much time as you can with one-on-one support, small group support, kind of finding times like throughout the day to try to connect with kids that either might have been absent or just need additional support. Just like when we're in person, there's a lot of students that we have that are behind academically, and so whether we're in person or not, we want to make sure we're providing that additional support that they need. And so doing that in the online environment means finding a lot of time at kind of random times to make sure that they can get that support. And then beyond that, one thing that that I always knew was important, but I didn't notice as much prior to distance learning, was just how many little conversations we have as adults during the day. We of course have our grade level meetings and our department meetings and all of those things. But in order to actually really support the kids in the way that they need to be supported, there's a million little conversations that happen every day about, oh, here's what I noticed with this kid. We talked about this with their family. Here's what was happening in my class. Is that happening with you? And so there's a lot of like phone calls and texting and trying to figure out how to essentially recreate that in this environment when we have less time with the kids. And so that adult facing time is one that I know hasn't gotten as much attention, but it's actually even more important now than it was when we were in person, because we have less time with our kids and we're trying to meet the same needs we had before, in addition to the needs that have come up during the pandemic. And then as far as my day-to-day with family, I wake up with the morning sounds on the monitor, when I start hearing them having a good time and jumping on each other and playing. And then as soon as I'm done teaching, my wife and I kind of rotate, like as soon as I'm done teaching, and then I'm watching him in his kindergarten class at Ortega. So I don't know if anyone's here from Ortega, but shout out to Miss HM, shout out to Miss Young and all the rest. Y'all are fantastic. And so then I support him to get him down for a nap. He's down for nap at like 12:58 and teaching at 1 o'clock, and it sort of goes like that every day, like everyone right now, right, with young kids, and so with any kids. And so that's pretty much what the day-to-day looks like. And yeah, I'm happy to answer more questions as we go through this.
Thank you for that, Chris. And what have you found as, before we move on to the rest of the day-to-day, as you're trying to recreate those opportunities to connect with teachers, to support other educators and other adults in your school community who are supporting students? Is there some way that you have found to do that efficiently? And also connected to that, we know that how important relationship building is. And that's one thing that's really stood out, is that is a challenge, in this situation, to continue to build relationships, especially as we were starting a new school year with new classrooms full of students. And so how have you been figuring out, and how have you been able to, and what support do you need in helping to build those relationships with students as you're moving through so many different sections of your day?
So I would break that down again into like the adult facing and the student facing. So just to start with the adult facing part of the question, there's a mix of formal and informal spaces where that happens. The formal spaces where that would happen once a week, we meet with our grade level, and part of a grade level meeting typically involves a process where we bring issues that we've noticed about various kids that have had needs that have come up that we want to address as a group. So we'll bring up a name, talk about what's going on, talk about what we've tried, what's working, what isn't, what have other folks noticed in their classes, Do we need to include social workers and counselors? Do we need a family liaison to be involved? What are things that maybe the previous grade level did to support? And so there's a lot of conversation that happens about each kid in figuring out what that is. And then we have the spaces where we're meeting with other teachers. And so there's another 7th grade English language arts teacher. We'll meet. And so of course we're talking about the English side of it, but then we're also trying to figure out how to deal with the things like turning on cameras and what are you doing to encourage kids to share in class, and how are you supporting kids that maybe didn't turn in their assignments. And so a lot of that touches on the socio-emotional supports that we need to provide, not just the academic ones. And then we also have meetings each week with members of our special education team, so special education teachers, paraprofessionals, other folks that are part of that support staff, where we're sort of targeting both the needs that have been identified in their IEPs or 504 plans, but then also thinking about what are their specific socio-emotional needs that they might need to have addressed, and how can we do that. So there's those formal spaces, and then we have our informal spaces, like I was mentioning before, where there's just a lot of phone calls and texting and additional meetings and late at night trying to figure out what's happening so that way we can support. And so that looks a variety of ways. It depends on the class and the teacher and who you're talking about, but there's just a lot of informal communication that's happening that typically would have happened during the school day, but now everyone's sort of trying to figure out like when we can pull that off, just given the nature of learning during a pandemic. And so there's that piece. And then as far as the student facing side, the relational piece, especially in middle school, for anyone that has middle school kids, is always going to be number one. The root of all the success that we have is built on a foundation of strong and loving relationships that we have with our students. Given that we began the year in distance learning, of course, it's presented a set of challenges that we've never had to confront before. And so all of those, again, just small and informal interactions that take place during the day, in addition to the larger ones built on restorative justice and academic conversations and all of those aspects of the in-person learning that we can rely on, of course, are in some ways there, but in many ways have changed, right? And so one way that we try to deal with that is making sure that we're finding ways to communicate more in a way that would be different than before. So for example, there's a lot more emailing with students than there probably was before, and at the middle school level they can be responsive compared to my 5-year-old. And so I've found that, and a lot of us have found that students are just much more willing to engage over email in a way maybe they weren't previously. And so that's one way to just like get those little messages of like support or having questions get asked, academic and socio-emotional. And then when we're in the classes, we can set up breakout rooms in Zoom, and so one-on-one and small group settings. And so just like when we're in person, those are academically focused conversations, and they are, every single one of those conversations is an opportunity to connect with a kid. So it's not just about like, what was the metaphor, or, what's happening with this theme, right? It's like, so what's going on, what's going on with you? How can I support, tell a story, and, here's, make a connection. And so there's all the different things that we do like in those settings, and just, there's a lot of finding every opportunity that presents itself to build those relational connections. So that way we can, over time, have that relationship as the foundation for the learning and for the success that we want our students to have.
Thank you for that. And Leslie, can you talk a little bit about what your work has been like this fall?
Hi, everybody. My name is Leslie. I'm the community school coordinator at MLK Middle School in the Portola. I'm also on the board of Parents for Public Schools. And I say that because I think for me, the number one sign of one of the biggest things that's really important is the way that we partner with our families. And I would say that my day-to-day life looks very, what a lot of things that Chris said rang really true for me, but my role in that is fairly different. I'm not in the classroom. As a community school coordinator, I think for ease of understanding, my job is very similar to an assistant principal in some ways. So my job is very much behind the scenes, macro, big picture, school-wide systems and structures. So when Chris was talking about like thinking about new ways to communicate, I'm part of the team that needs to kind of rethink how we communicate in our school. And I think of my job in 3 different chunks as well, actually, one of which is the ways in which I support young people. So, a lot of the things that I worked on in the fall semester were centered around how do we be intentional about supporting individual students? Because in person, it's a different structure than when we're in online. And we find that the problems that are coming up are really different. So for example, we don't have any disciplinary issues. However, we have a lot of mental health issues that are popping up in place of that. And that presents some very unique challenges. How do we do that over Zoom? So a lot of my work has been how do I support educators in supporting young people? So how do I create the systems and structures so that young people can thrive, and how educators can support them? So a lot of that has been with young people. And then my second chunk is really around educators. How do I really support educators in doing what they're doing? So a large chunk of my job this fall has been, we completely pivoted our school. And I do want to do a shout out. My principal is here listening, because he is always sitting in a stance of listening to families and educators. But we have all of our non-classroom staff, whether it's paraprofessionals, our counselors, our social worker, our nurse, all of us have pivoted to spend some time in classrooms. So that, because classroom teachers, imagine how do you take attendance? How do you facilitate breakout rooms? How do you just, all of those things, how does one human being do that? It's impossible. And so we've pivoted our entire school to be able to do that. So those are to be able to support those classroom teachers. And so we've really been able to, but the cognitive load and actual load to actually pivot that school is tremendous. So we've really had to rethink how we do school in every facet of the world. So that's one way that I've been, supporting educators. And then the third big chunk is, how do we support families? So one of the things that for us is really, really important at MLK is attuning to the collective crisis that we're in and that trauma that is ensuing because of that. So for example, before the pandemic, over 80% of our families at MLK were qualified for free and reduced lunch. What that means in real terms is that 80% of our families, for a family of 4 living in San Francisco, is making under $50,000 a year. I'm pausing on purpose for dramatic effect, kind of. But what does that mean when the pandemic hit? When pandemic hits, what does that do to our families? I mean, we all know these stories. And so how do we as a school really, really be able to support our families in that way? And so that's been a huge chunk of my work, is really being intentional about attuning to families' basic needs, but also what is their experience in distance learning? How do we communicate with families in different ways? How do we be a source of comfort and support and resource for them? And so my job has really been about systems and structures to support all of these 3 groups of people at my school.
Thanks, Leslie. And Susan, you're not in the classroom anymore. And I imagine that your days, and maybe we won't spend as much time on what your day looks like, because there are other questions that I have for you specifically, but do talk a little bit about what your time is spent on now as opposed to pre-pandemic. What are the challenges that you're seeing kind of across the board that educators are needing support with? What kind of challenges are you having to solve on a regular basis?
Thank you, Michelle. So a lot of the things that were in place before are still in place as part of my job. And so this is like on top of that. So very, very busy days, very long days. First of all, we are in negotiations more than we normally are. There are so many things to think about, and making sure that things are done well and covered. In terms of some of it is problem solving. So something as simple as not all paraeducators and substitute teachers have devices yet. And so especially, well, I probably don't have to explain how difficult that makes things. And substitute teachers need to be able to do the work. And so that's just one of the things. Figuring out what do we need to simultaneously support and improve crisis distance learning, which is what we call it, and plan for when schools reopen. And so it's a steep learning curve for a lot of us. What does that mean? What does it mean to be in a pandemic and plan? I also, in normal times, now it's ramped up, reaching out to elected officials. How can you support our public education system? How can you support our students? What do we need to do to support you so that in return you can support us? And I feel like that's a critical part. And I spend time talking with educators, again, a normal part of my job, but educators are feeling this trauma as well. I've seen, I hear educators breaking down in tears because they're so worried about their students and exhausted. I think you said that earlier. I haven't heard the word exhausted coming from the mouths of educators as much before as I do now. And those are the basics. And then there's the media, to be able to talk to the media as part of what I do, and making sure they understand that we're all trying to pull in the same direction to make sure our kids get what they need.
Thank you for that. I think that none of that is surprising to me, hearing those things. And I think many of us are spending a lot of time doing advocacy work, which we all have to, right? If we're going to be able to get the resources we need, we have to all be working together to make that happen. So I can appreciate that. I have to say, though, the one thing that did surprise me is we still don't have all paraeducators, and substitutes I haven't, dug into as much, but paraeducators still don't all have devices.
Yeah, I believe most of them do now, but at the beginning, it took a while. It did. And
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So so maybe there's a lot of different directions I would like to go during this meeting, but one of the things that you said near the beginning of your list that I'd like to talk with all of you about, and that is, how can we improve the distance, crisis learning right now? As we're looking at that, I know that the school district leadership is looking at that. You all certainly, as people on the front lines in the classrooms, are thinking about that. Parents are thinking about that all the time. And Chris, you've got a kid in kindergarten, who's doing distance learning, which we know that distance learning is so difficult and challenging for especially our youngest learners. So what is it that we can do together? Because we know there will be students in distance learning for a good period of time, even when we start eventually bringing students back into the classroom. How can we improve that experience? Anybody can take a stab at it first, whoever'd like to, Chris or Leslie or Susan.
I mean, I can go. I don't think it's, for me personally, I don't think it's that different from in person, which is that I think that if we can sit in a space of listening to one another, I think that is like the most critical thing. I think that I think the national rhetoric around this has been really polarizing, and I just want to name that right away. And that it would be, it's scary to read some of the things that are happening out nationally, not necessarily Bay Area. But I really wish that, I think that if there were more opportunities to actually sit and listen more deeply to what the distance learning experience has been like for folks, whether it's families, for students and young people, for educators, for principals, for the superintendent, whoever. I think that, like, if we can do that, I think we'll move I think we can make leaps and bounds. But I think that there haven't been very many opportunities. And I think that when I was approached to come here, I was like, yes, immediately. I think I texted back within 10 minutes, because I'm like, yes, I want to sit and listen. Although I feel like here people want to listen to me more, but I want to stay rooted in what the experiences are for our young people and our families. And then, because once I know what those things are, then I can try and make it happen. And I think about what happened in the spring when we were first thrust into this in March. We put out a student survey, I think it was in April, middle of April, right when we started kind of instruction. And students, we were like, just what is some feedback? What's going on for you? And we were so surprised by it. the number one thing was that students were really confused about the instructions on their assignments on Google Classroom. We were like, what? And so we had no idea. So what did we do? We actually created videos to explain what those instructions were for those assignments, because we had no idea. And so I just think about that as an example of how, if we sit in a space of listening to one another more, I think that we can learn how to move forward together.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And Susan, I see I'll have you speak in just a second. And one thing, it's time intensive, but, I've been wondering, how can we create more opportunities for that regular dialogue to happen, not just like once a semester or once a quarter, but finding ways to regularly gather input from the students, from the families, and from the educators who also need specific types of support that maybe somebody hasn't thought of in the past. So I really appreciate that. And I'm wondering, one thing that hasn't felt as clear to me from the district leadership is how are we defining success during this time? Is it that we want everyone, at their, I can guess what the answer would be to this, but I will just say it, is that, are we looking that everybody meets a certain academic, goal by the end of the year? Or is it that we're looking for, we want everybody to have a relationship, that there are many adults who are checking with them regularly? Or what are the goals that will measure progress? What defines success during this really weird year that hopefully there's not another repeat of for another 100 years or something? And so, maybe if it fits in any of your comments, over the rest of this next half hour, talking about like, what does success mean and how can we move towards that? I think that would be a really good place to start. But Susan, you unmuted yourself. It looks like you had something you wanted to add, as we talked about improving distance learning experience.
Right, it's kind of tagging on to what Leslie said. And if Jerry Almanza were able to be here, I was telling Michelle earlier, she did promise her young daughter that she wouldn't be in meetings every night. That's why she prepared videos to share with you all. But the time is such a big thing, time for this and time for that. And one of the things it would be great to have more time for is for teachers, what we try to do in person too. How do we share best practices most effectively with each other? So I know that Jerry has high attendance rates for her students at Cesar Chavez and engagement. So what is she doing? How can she share that with someone else? I've seen that one teacher has done basically tutorials on Facebook for fellow educators. How do you set up a background? How do you do breakout rooms, all these different things, which certainly people are much more conversant with now than they were at the beginning, but always educators having time to be able to turn to each other is extremely helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris.
So yeah, to build on what Susan just mentioned, as far as like supporting educators with improving this environment, just one thing I want to mention is, as far as context with technology, this is something that for a lot of our schools, we had some Chromebook carts or some technology we used before, but I know at a place like Everett, at most you could probably get a Chromebook cart for 3 days in a row. So it was mostly for assessments, or surveys or things of that nature. It wasn't the main tool that we used for teaching kids. And so once, when closure happened, it was literally on 24 hours notice. And so there wasn't really a chance to sort of, think deeply as a school community together about what this was going to mean and how to move forward. And of course we went into the summer and came back. And so one thing that, so I say that just because one of the most important and challenging and necessary things that we're working on this year is figuring out how to use technology to support kids. And so I know that Google Classroom is something that we all have fallen back on, and it has a lot of great features, and we're very glad that we have it, but it clearly on its own is insufficient to support kids in the way that they need to be supported academically. And so there are various other platforms that are out there. And I think one thing that has been challenging is that as a teacher, there's not that same amount of time with kids to experiment and try different instructional methods out and see if they work, see what doesn't work, test again, figure that out, because every single moment that we have is so valuable because there is limited time. And so on the one hand, we want to make sure that we are putting the best possible tech platform, in front of kids that we can use as a tool to make sure that we're meeting their academic and social emotional needs. On the other hand, as educators, that's not something that most of us have really used before, and so the learning curve has been pretty steep as far as figuring out what that should be. So your question around like how the district can support with that, I think some ways that they have supported with that are trying to essentially curate for us what the best platforms could be. So I know, just speaking personally, there's a ton of things that are out there. People have been talking about Nearpod and applications like Jamboard and Padlet and all these things that are out there. And today I was at a district PD professional development to learn about a new platform that the district just formed a partnership with called Actively Learn, which is going to, I think, in my opinion, I had never heard of it before. But, this is going to be something that's going to allow so much more personalization with the ways that we are teaching reading to kids. There's so many more features on there, everything from additional built-in accommodations for various academic needs that students might have if they have disabilities. There's language translation. There's ways to make sure kids can't read ahead if you want to make sure they can ask a question first and they can interact with each other on it. And so this is one example of how there's a platform out there that I had no idea existed. I learned about it today. I have winter break to sort of now figure out how I'm going to integrate it into my classroom for the third quarter. But this is not something that I even knew about or that the district even had a partnership with in September, October. And so I think for a lot of us, like, we have been trying to figure out how to integrate the best possible tools into our instruction, but that does take time. We've essentially tried to build virtual schools during a pandemic and use technology in a way that most of us have never done before. While at the same time making sure that we're still trying to make sure that kids are, achieving at the highest levels possible with their reading, with their writing, with their math, with everything else that they're working on. And of course, meeting like the various socio-emotional needs that have come up during the pandemic. And so I think that the district being able to play that role of curating like the best possible resources for us, and then, like Susan said, sharing those best practices and playing that role of coordinating different groups across the district to make sure that information gets down to the school site level is incredibly important. The last thing I would just say is that especially for students, family communication, I know, has always come up as an issue that has like the most important thing that typically families have brought up when we've had events with families at our school, and I assume other schools too. It's even more important now, especially now that we have less time with everyone's children. And so the need for us on the school site side to make sure that we are finding new ways and more frequent ways to communicate. And then on the family side to definitely be like providing that feedback loop for us to let us know how we can be supportive and helping us figure out what that might look like is incredibly important, just given how since we don't have that one-on-one time, that small group time in person, that we really are even more reliant than we've ever been on having just a very effective feedback loop between schools and families.
Thanks, Chris. What's really clear to me, as I look at the time here, is that we need so much more time for these conversations, and we're going to have to find some ways to do more of that. I'd love to talk with you, Susan, about finding more opportunities for us to have parents and teachers in dialogue with each other. But we'll keep going until the end here. And I also just want to note that there are some really good questions that are coming up in the chat, and you are all welcome to answer some of those. We'll get to some of them if we can, but if you want to answer any of those while you're listening to someone else speak, then please go ahead. Let's see. So I want to ask, let's see, there's so many things that I'd like to ask you. I know that I want to, in a minute, get to talking about contract negotiations and talking about a return to insight. So I want to talk about that in a minute. But before we get there, just want to also just continue this, just reiterate what I'm hearing from all of you about is creating time and space. I'm hearing that theme around for educators to be able to continually improve their practice, creating space for listening and, being in dialogue with families, hearing what's working and what's not working so that we can continually iterate. And it seems like the flexibility is the name of the game as much as we can be, but we're all sort of learning to do that as much as we possibly can. Are you all, as I'm looking at a couple of these questions, have your schools found effective ways to engage families on a very regular basis around what's working or not working, and or students? Leslie and Chris, have you all found effective ways to do that?
So Chris and I was like looking at him. So I think for me at MLK, I think, and I want to be 100% transparent, not only is the MLK principal here, our family liaison is also providing interpretation at the same time. So there's 3 of us here. I think that communicating with families has always been a struggle in many ways. And I think there's ways in which it's easier now, and ways in which, the culture is that everything's online, everything's texting, everything is, Zooming now. So we've seen ways in which we've been able to partner more meaningfully together. And then there's ways in which we've really, really struggled. And I think the parts that we've really struggled are the families who are struggling. We have a significant number of families where I was on a call with a parent the other day for an hour and a half because she was crying hysterically because her CalFresh benefits were cut and she didn't know how she was going to feed her 3 kids. And I'm sitting here on the other end and having to hold these stories, and there's dozens at our school like that. And so how do we attune to attuning to the basic needs and linking them with long-term sustainable solutions, and then while simultaneously thinking about what is their experience with distance learning, right? And so actually at our school, we have our principal, who's here, made the decision that instead of all middle schools were supposed to do student-led conferences, we didn't do that. And instead, we wanted to sit in a place of listening to families about their experience in distance learning. And so what we did was, instead of student-led conferences, we just asked families, how's your kid doing? What is your experience? What are things that we're doing well? What are or not? And so we have that structure, and we're continuing, up until Friday, to call families to all the families that we weren't able to get a hold of. We have a lot of families we have the wrong phone number, who the only method of communication is one-on-one texting, not even mass texting, and so we spend a significant amount of our time actually reaching out and communicating with families. I think that we've built some really good structures. We do monthly feedback sessions where families just come and just tell us what their experience is like. We also have, I think, actually both Chun and SEM might know, but every 2 weeks, there's what we call coffee chats that we still do. And we send weekly communications. We have something that I don't think a lot of schools did. We had a cell phone number already set up before we went into distance learning. And so there's been a way in which families can text us anytime, even before pandemic. And so we had that structure already in place. So there's been a lot of, and we have a really strong family partnerships team, in which most schools don't have that. And so we've been really intentional about it. There's a lot of work to be done. There could be 4 of us that are full-time working to partner with our families, and it still wouldn't be enough. But I think it's just an ongoing thing, but it's a huge priority for us, especially now, more than ever.
Thank you. It's great to hear about that. And I think, one of the things that we organized back in August, I think it was for people to come and share things that worked during the spring and put them all in one place, so that parent leaders at different schools could take the good ideas from other schools back to other places. And it seems that while that educators need a place to share and learn from each other, we also need to create more often spaces for all of our school leadership, including parent leaders, to say, hey, they found something that works really well over there. Like, let's steal that idea, and use it. And so, I do know there are other schools doing those kind of coffee chats, which are a lot easier to participate in when you don't have to be headed off, the travel time to get to your job, and you can kind of just pop in for a little while. But I love the idea of the monthly feedback sessions. I think I see this note from Susan that there's a lot of folks who are trying to just help their families meet basic needs. And I've been hearing that from other folks I know all around the city too, both people who are working in schools and also families who are connected to others. So that is certainly true. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to coordinate. And I want to note there was actually a comment here from Principal Essien talking about that I think we should put a pin in this and talk about this in another meeting, is what areas of growth do we have? Because this is, everybody says, right, so often these days, is that all this pandemic has really exposed the inequities in our systems and exposed the broken parts, the things, and we have, as horrible as this situation is, there's a lot of opportunity for us to improve the system now. Like as it is in complete disruption, we have an opportunity to make it work better for everybody. And so I would love to have another meeting where we have a deeper conversation about that, is how can we take what we're learning here and what is being exposed now and work towards something better as we move through it and out of it. But because we're nearing the end of time, Susan, can we talk for a minute about questions that I hear a lot from parents who are not as familiar with how collective bargaining works? You know, what is collective bargaining? Who is involved? What's the structure of it? You know, we'll often hear, you know, occasionally when the superintendent is here, he'll say, oh, I can't answer this specific question because there are, you know, rules that we have in collective bargaining about bargaining in public. And, you know, so you'll hear things like that, but there are lots of parents who are not familiar with how that works if they are not part of the public sector or a union themselves. So could you just talk a little bit about that process?
Sure. The process that we're engaging in right now is the same as it is when we are bargaining our regular contract, which by the way has expired. It means everything that's in it stays in place, but there are no changes and no improvements. Even I just want to say in February, before COVID, we had an all-day conference to talk about how do we want to improve our contract in a way that's called bargaining for the common good. So it's not necessarily wages, conditions, and hours of work, which are those are the three cornerstones of collective bargaining. Those are the three topics we are entitled under the law to negotiate about. But bargaining for the common good is taking that a step further. How can we get more for our students that school districts don't have to bargain over? How can we get parents involved? The last time in bargaining, we did get some language about having parents on committees with at schools for safe and supportive schools. So now we are doing, as I mentioned, more bargaining than ever because of all the details that we have to work out. The people who are involved, from what we always are sure to do, is we want to have experts in every field of education. So Leslie is on the bargaining team because she brings the support staff perspective, the community schools perspective. Chun is on the bargaining team. He brings not only a paraeducator perspective, but a family liaison. And so we have classroom teachers from every, you know, elementary, middle, high, and early ed. And we have support providers, so special education for sure, because I know a lot. I don't know all of that, and I'm not in the classroom. So we want to make sure we're bringing expertise to the table. And then the district does similarly. So the chief of labor relations is the main spokesperson for the district. And then people from all the different departments, from HR, from salaries and benefits, from curriculum and instruction, whatever issue is being bargained. I still say on the table, virtual or otherwise. We all try to bring people to the table who can best do the problem solving and bring expertise. And so right now it's about having to consider so many things, making sure that it will be safe, that people will be safe, people of all ages, that we have the support that we need. We've been tackling some, just for example, and this I can talk about, we're working on a proposal right now for how to do in-person special education assessments in a safe way. And so I would say in general, the things that are not appropriate to talk about in public are some of the details, because as we go back and forth, things may change. And so in terms of giving out information that turns out, well, it didn't really land on that, it landed here. And it is, we engage in traditional negotiations, which means one party will make a proposal, the other party responds to it, and we go back and forth until we come to agreement. And we also include, because we can, sometimes we include less formal conversations where we do some brainstorming together. For example, we brought to discussions, it's hard to figure out time, maybe it was a couple months ago, what other alternatives are possible besides being inside a classroom with students? Is it possible to be outdoors? It's something we haven't done a formal proposal yet, but we're on the verge of doing that, I want to say, and that we've said publicly as well. Are there ways to bring in students into a neighborhood school? Maybe it's not their school, but maybe they can have an interaction with a teacher there who can help them with their work, or a social worker or a counselor. And so again, those are ideas, and we have taken we've taken the opportunity to have these serious conversations that aren't exactly traditional bargaining, but are problem solving and solution oriented.
Thank you. And so with the current, so the contract officially expired, well, it expired at the end of June. And so it holds now, you all did an MOU. For those who don't know, that's a memorandum of understanding with the district in order to get ready for this distance or crisis learning that we are in right now. And that was finalized right before school started in August. And then you're in process for a hybrid learning MOU, is that correct? Yes. And so how is that moving along? Is there a desired timeline? You know, how is that progressing? What can you share about that?
So I can share that both parties have prepared proposals around what it looks like to go back into classrooms in a hybrid model, focus on safety and how we just figure out all the details. So how do you even move within a school to make sure that stable, safe cohorts, stable, small cohorts stay that way? And so one of the things we've been talking about is the very important support folks, not classroom teachers. A couple of them are on this call. How can we integrate them into interacting with our students and still maintain safe and stable small cohorts? Because with the idea similar to community hubs and pods, that you maintain the same cohort in a stable way. So how do you bring a social worker into a classroom, or do you? And what about, and I'll tell you that paraeducators, we may have to change the way their school day looks, because special education paraeducators in person go into multiple classes in 1 week. We can't be, you know, anywhere 12 to 14 kids in a class for a safe bubble. It'll be broken every time they go into another class. So these are all things we didn't have to think about before. I mean, although I would say our preference with and this is going to go back to resources and funding, which every conversation about public education does. We need the resources. Ideally, wouldn't it be great if we had a paraeducator in every classroom all day, not switching around, getting to know the kids? When I taught kindergarten at John Sweat, so you know how long ago that is, the school closed, sadly, in 2006. There was a paraeducator alongside me in my kindergarten classroom, our kindergarten classroom, for over half the day. And so maybe we'll be looking at those models for hybrid learning.
Yep, I remember that when my oldest started in, I don't even remember what year it was. Kindergarten that's how it was. I believe he started in 2005. So that would have been around the same time. And there were half-day paras and on all those classrooms. So yeah, thank you. And I know we're a few minutes over, but I want to just, I know it's not super quick, but just a question about, you know, this conversation on the table now about moving to in-person learning. I know you all are working on this MOU. If you could each just name, and I know this won't be easy, but if you could name maybe one or two things that you think are the most important to consider as we move towards a successful return to safe in-person learning. And I'll take safety off the table. We know that safety is, we want to make sure everybody is safe as we do that. What are some of the things, and especially something that maybe folks haven't thought of, or you just think, no, this is the thing that we've got to really remember. Just one or two things from each of you that we need to make sure are considered as we move towards this safe in-person learning sometime as planned, you know, beginning in the end of January, you know, depending on the conditions of our lots of conditions, but that's the plan at the moment, right? Whoever wants to start.
You know, it's hard. It's really hard to separate safety from what we need, because when I'm thinking as a kindergarten teacher. So I go back to the classroom. We're all so excited about being there. Kindergartners are not known for maintaining distance from other people. They need help tying their shoes and blowing their noses and all of that. And they're learning social interactions. So how do we practice that? How do we do that in a way that everybody gets to learn, everybody gets to learn socialization, gets supported with social emotional skills and academic skills. So, it involves some resources, it involves some really deep thinking about what will that really look like.
So for you, I guess to sum up then, recognizing the complexity of meeting each of those needs, of the academic needs, the social needs, and the actual behaviors of young children and whichever age children we're looking at. That combination of those, the consideration of that.
I have to say that I knew this was going to be a complex issue. There are complexities on top of complexities that come up that we haven't even thought of every day. What if students are in school and then go to an after-school program?
Mm-hmm.
I know I'm talking about safety again, but it's all.
Yeah, no, I know it's easy for me to say, you know, we all know we want to be safe, but defining what that means, I know can get really complicated. So I didn't mean to make it too simple, because I know it's not simple at all. And I know that many people, and I hope that, you know, lots of people are trying to take a solutions-oriented approach to it, and recognizing it's an and, right? Not an but, it's an and. Like, we want to be solutions-oriented and recognize the complexities and move with as much urgency as we can, right? Like, it's all of those things combined. Yeah.
And there is one thing. So hearing various people talk, one thing we heard today as an assumption was that when young kids go back to the classroom, they won't be able to use manipulatives. Yes, they will be able to, as long as they have their own. So in terms of resources, every child has to have their own set of whatever the manipulatives are, and they have to be cleaned. That's doable. That's doable.
Absolutely. Thank you. Leslie, what would you say? Priorities.
Yeah, I would say my number one thing is choice. Families need to be able to choose if they want to send their children back or not, because every family is unique in their own circumstance. And I think that's really, really important. That also means it's significantly more complicated. But I also think that also means choice for our educators too, because educators also are in similar situations where they're caring for their parent, or, you know, their child is immunocompromised or whatever. So I think for me, if we're taking safety, you know, off the proverbial table, that I think that families and educators need to be able to choose if they come back in person or if they continue distance learning.
Thanks, Leslie. Chris, what do you think?
So there's two things that come to mind. One is around how we're going to be able to implement restorative practices in this type of learning environment. And so one of like the I think, most exciting, most important changes that we've made sort of in the last decade has been moving towards restorative practices. So that way we are, moving away from more punitive and harsh punishment and towards something that's more about building a sense of belonging for children and supporting kids through the inevitable conflicts that are going to arise. So that way they, have more dignity in the process and feel more respect and a sense of ownership over their school. But that requires a lot of conversations, a lot of one-to-one conversations, small groups. It's an ongoing process. It's not like, oh, we did restorative practices, now we're done, we restored. It's an ongoing between adults, between kids, between adults and kids. And one thing that I'm not really sure yet, it's on my mind, is something that we're going to have to really be intentional about, really be purposeful about, and think through is, what do restorative practices look like in this environment? Because we do need to be able to communicate with each other in that sort of patient and healing and frequent way. And so what will that look like? Because the other option is moving back towards a more punitive way, and I don't think anybody wants to go in that direction. And so if we're going to continue with this, what changes need to be made to support that? Academically, I would say that, and this came up in the chat a bit too, as far as what are we going to do is for students that are behind. And I'd say that for most teachers, all teachers, we're used to working with students that are a little behind, far behind. So that challenge won't be new. The challenge is going to be around just the raw numbers of kids that are going to be further behind than when we were in person before closure. One of the best strategies, if not the best strategies for that, has been around supporting kids with small group and one-to-one environments. And so if what that means is that if we're going to be able to continue again down that direction, what does that look like? If we're going to have these barriers between us because we need to work with safety. So again, it does come back to these issues around safety, but it is a very real issue, because I know for me, like the most success that I've had with kids that are far behind has been, again, rooted first in relationships, and then second in providing that personalized attention and making sure I'm meeting their very specific needs, whatever those might be. And in order to make sure that you can connect with a large group of kids, that means a lot of one-on-one and small group support. So what does that look like in this environment? And we're going to have to be creative about that. And again, just think through other models that have been used in other places that have already gone down this path, and see what's worked and what hasn't, and then do our own learning in our unique context and our school sites. But that is something that I very much have on my mind right now, because that's been a challenge in the distance learning environment, and figuring out how to make that work. And I think we've made a lot of strides this semester, but once we go back to in person, and there's more of these health and safety protocols that we need to make sure that we're following, we have to really be thoughtful about what that's going to look like, so we can make sure that students get the education that they deserve.
Thank you. There are so many more questions that I would like to ask all of you. I wish we had more time, and I want to respect everybody's evenings, especially, well, everybody, everybody's been working all day and teaching all day, and we've all had long days. And so I think we're going to have to wind this up. There are some great questions that we talked about before that we didn't get to, but also that have been coming up the chat that I'm going to save. And I would love to invite you all to come back again, soon, to continue this conversation and to get more into what can we do. What do you all need? What kinds of supports do you need to be successful in supporting our students? We know that the single most important factor on our students' academic success is the teacher in front of their classroom. And, how do we support you in that? How do we continue to support our families collectively so that they don't, that so many people are just at their wits' end, their children are not themselves, right now. I keep hearing from families who just don't even recognize their kids right now. And so how do we collectively work together to support all those efforts? So I would love to continue this dialogue and to continue inviting you all and other educators to work with us. So maybe what we could end, kind of a final note from all of you, is to maybe talk about any, as I just lose my train of thought, let's end the meeting on what are you hopeful about? What is something that you, either a bright spot that you've seen or something that gives you hope that we're going to move through this in some better way, just as a final closing thought. Anything you want to leave? Oh, actually, and I know what I was thinking about was so you could say that, and then if there is some way that you see that we can work together, something brief, because we are running late, on the end, I want to let everybody get back to their families. But if there's something you want to add on, like how we can work together as parents and educators. So why don't we work backwards? Chris, we'll start with you, and then Leslie, and then Susan.
To the second question first, I would say it's a very practical thing. Getting and supporting all families to be able to join ParentView and have updated contact information. And so that's really challenging. I think prior to the closure, we only had about a third of families that actually were on ParentView. And so one of the challenges around communication is that as teachers, we don't have updated or we just have incorrect contact information. And so a big part of reaching out to families is just trying to figure out how we actually can connect with them. And that's a process, and getting that updated is a process, but that would be one of the most important things as far as like really making sure that we can connect with all families frequently and consistently and effectively. And then as far as hope, there's a lot of things that give me hope. So, at the end of the day, I'd say I'm stopping just because, again, it is an emotional experience. I'd say that like the time that we get with our kids each day, gives us hope. They're resilient, they're working hard, they're showing up, so we need to show up for them.
Thank you, Chris.
How do I follow that? But I think the thing that I have a lot of hope for is just sort of, I never knew in a visceral way how amazing our young people are. Really, it's astronomical to see what we're seeing. Like, even though it's so hard, like the amount of crying I've seen in meetings has been exponentially higher in staff meetings, and I'm the person who's crying most of the time. Now I'm like crying like every day in some sort of random meeting. And but I think the things that really give me hope are when I see, there's still so many moments of innovation and insight and inspiration that's happening from our young people. And I think that like it is a misnomer to say that like all distance learning is horrible. I think a lot of it's really hard. I think that our young people are showing up in ways I've never seen before, actually. Like, there's so many bright spots. Last week at our school, we had this huge celebration where we had these bright spots of what's happening, and we all walked away in tears. We were all crying on camera, like how amazing this work has been. So I think that is a really source of inspiration. I think the second thing is that our educators, especially, I don't know, it's harder for me to assess across, and I imagine it's this, but everybody's learned so much about their practice. And guess what's going to happen over the next 2 weeks over winter break? If you think that educators are not going to work the entire time, I think that's not a accurate description. But everybody's going to be reflecting back on what we did well, what we could have done better, what were some areas of growth, and we're going to come back raring to go. And I know that there's been a lot of innovation, and I have a lot of hope for that. And I also think that we've learned a lot of really good lessons on how to partner with our families. And I know at our school, we've already started to begin that work of how we're going to do things differently to support our families, but to partner with our families and to listen to our families. So all of those things, I can imagine that spring semester, I think that there's going to be a palpable change.
Thank you for that. Susan.
Okay, so that was an example of what gives me hope. These two amazing educators, and they're not the only two, there are thousands of them. And I have the honor of working with them and being guided by them. And that really gives me hope. The vaccine gives me hope. I mean, that's going to make it more possible, more real. And children, I mean, Chris said it. We don't have a choice. We have to fight. We have to fight to make things better. I'm now a grandmother. There's a reason for me to keep doing the work I do. If there weren't before, there's an 8-month-old who lives right across the hall from me, who's depending on us. And in terms of working together, this is one way to do it. So much of what we do that makes us successful is based on communication, one-on-one communication, small group, all the way up to mass media. That's the way we get organized. And that's the way we make sure that we continue to fight for what our kids need, for what we need. And there are all kinds of venues. There's the Close the Gap Coalition, there are individual schools, there's our union. And continuing the dialogue is critical if we're going to make things change for the better, and fight for the resources. The word fight always sounds, we're fighting, but we're not going to get the resources we need for our kids if we don't fight for them.
100% agree with that. I am so inspired by this conversation tonight. Thank you all for making the time to join us. It's wonderful to hear about what you're doing, what's happening. It's nice to have the insight. I think an integral part of the learning process is reflection. And when we make room for that, I think that's important for all of us to move forward. And I appreciate, as you just said, Susan, opportunities for communication. We've been talking about it throughout this entire hour. And so I look forward to creating more of those opportunities with all of you and with others, not just those who are in the room now. So thank you so much, again, for making the time tonight. We had folks, Chris and Leslie shared their emails in the chat. Susan's email I can share. It's available on the UESF website. She's accessible, and continue sharing your ideas, everybody who's attending, with of how we can move through all this together. Continue sharing your questions and we'll find ways to get them answered. But just thank you all for being present. Thanks for making the time. And thanks for all that you're doing and for your service. Really appreciate you.
Thank you too. I mean, we certainly couldn't do our jobs without parents.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. All right. Good night and have a good winter break, everybody. I hope it's restful.
Thank you.
All right. Good night.